Hello, everybody. Welcome again to yet another session, session 3 of Stories of India Season 2. And today I have with me Devnath Pathak, Shantanu Chaudhuri, and Gautam Chintamani to discuss Kasam Paida Karne Wale. Ki, we are here to discuss the phenomena called Mithunda, who is no other than Mithun Chakravarti. And to tell you, Dev is a sociologist and professor and author. Shantanu is an author and editor and journalist. Gautam Chintamani is a historian and author and journalist. So, in between this little universe that we have created, we have three authors, one professor, one historian, one editor, two journalists, and three film lovers, all packed in three esteemed panelists. So you can see that we have made all preparations to go as quirky as Mitunda actually was, and we are here to discuss Mitunda, कसम कर पैदा करने वाले की. So, initially, to begin with, I would like to invoke some nostalgia and request the panelists to share their favorite Mitunda moments from his films. We can go one by one. Dev, Shantanu, and Joel Gautam. Let's go.
My all-time favorite moment with the Mithun Chakravarti is obviously from the earliest part of my childhood when I had seen. Probably my first introduction was through this. I think it was a Rajshri production, Tarana. Uh,
you have taken my memory. Gunche lage hai कहने.
yeah, exactly. So it was very early on in my childhood. So I thought that that was the ideal imagination of a image of a lover with this guitar on his shoulder, and then breaking the boundary and making love with this Banjara girl. That's my moment. In spite of all kind of better performances that one gets to see later on, that stays on in my head.
Shantanu, please come up with an alternative.
Like it's uh, my earliest recollections is actually fighting with a couple of my friends who were huge Mithun Chakravarti fans at a time when I was an Amitabh Bachchan fan. So I used to have these running feuds with a couple of my closest friends who, particularly in the late 80s, in the 80s, like not late 80s, when Mithun had started to rise and Amitabh Bachchan had sort of reached so they used to always say, every time a Mithun film, and I used to. So that's one of the earliest things, earliest memories I have. And apart from, of course, uh, Gunche, Tarana, I was in Shillong, and for some reason, Mithun was huge in Shillong. A film like Tarana, in fact, I am witness to it. It ran in a hall called Singhania. It was owned by the Singhania group. It ran in that hall for years together, and every year it would run. It would complete a year's run. The Barjatias would actually uh, gift a car or a vehicle to the cinema hall owner, and it used to be huge. So that's another memory of Mithun Chakravarti is actually going to bunking classes from my class 9 or 10. I must have been, and 6 7 of us friends actually bunked classes to go to a film called Sun Sajna. I don't know if you've even heard of the film.
Yes.
It's again a Tarachan Barjatia film
Yeah.
with Mithun and Ranjita. And I remember, you know, police walas actually wielding lathis too, and we did not get tickets, of course, but then a couple of our resourceful friends actually managed to patao the manager and the ticket keeper, and we sat on modas. We actually got modas from the manager's room to carry inside and sat on modas uh, next to the actual seats, to watch Sun Sajna, because it was a Mithun Chakravarti film, and because all my friends in Shillong, classmates in Shillong, were huge fans. These are some of the most vivid memories, like while fighting with my friends for Amitabh Bachchan, and vis-a-vis Mithun Chakravarti, also, fighting to get into a hall, in Shillong to watch a Mithun Chakravarti film, which I don't think many people even remember now, but it was that kind of a craze he had in Shillong.
Right. Gautam, what's yours?
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Fantastic to connect with you, Koral, Shantanu, and Dev. So, Mithun Chakravarti evokes so much of mixed reactions. I mean, like hearing Dev and Shantanu talk about Mithunda, you get uh, an idea of the spectrum. For me, I have a strange recollection of not just one, but a few first Mithun Chakravarti memories. So for me, the first thing that comes to mind is a strange mix of Tarana and Hum Panch. I think Hum Panch would have
Yeah,
been a childhood favorite film because uh, the late Bapu Garu was a very dear friend of my grandfather, Dr. Arudra. So any Bapu film used to be a highlight. So and surprisingly, the kind of partnership that Bapuji and Mithunda have had, Prem Pratigya, Pyari Behna, you look at the range that he has exploited that Mithun displayed. At the same time, growing up in the 80s, you had a very strange image of Mithun Chakravarti in your mind because on the one hand, you kept hearing about his debut and Brigya and how he didn't have a job after that and how he's there and Phool Khile Hai Gulshan Gulshan in that little song he's there or he's there with Rekha in Do Anjane. And then in the 80s you have Disco Dancer, you have Commando, you have bizarre films coming out one after the other and you have some great films like Mujrim, or Data. I still remember Data's catchphrase, prayers go up and blessings come down. So that's the kind of impact that Mithun Chakravarti had on your conscious mind. And this is also a phase where, like Shantanu was mentioning, that, Mr. Bachchan's plateauing out or gets participates in active public life. So there is a space which is empty, and then you have these young guys like Anil Kapoor's and your Sunny Deols and your Jackie Shroffs who are being touted as the next big thing. But what about somebody like a Mithun who's got a dedicated fan following? So it's a strange mix that comes to your mind when you think of Mithunda. But even in these kind of films, I mean, if you see a Sitara or if you see a Shisha, I mean, in today's world, in the post Me Too world, if you see a film like Shisha, you understand that how how fantastic an idea it was to explore within the realm of popular Hindi films. So for those who haven't seen Shisha, please check it out. It's got Munmun Sen, Malika Sarabhai, and Mithun Chakravarti, and it's a fantastic film, a very well crafted film. So yeah, Koral, one of the reasons for being here is because Mithun, just brings out so many things in you.
and
Absolutely.
you can't talk of Mithun and not talk of that particular phase. I actually might be the only one who watched a couple of these movies in a theater, the Gunmaster G9 films. And a true blue Hindi film lover can ever get over that experience of Mithun Chakravarti, Mausam Hai, Gani Ka Bajane Ka, that kind of thing. So I that also continues to be a very, and also there was a certain, curry western, he was part of a couple of curry westerns at that point of time, where he's
Yeah, yeah,
wearing
films
that
like Wanted and yeah, yeah,
Wanted, and where he's wearing that hat and going on a horse. I think one of the songs Dil Hai Akela, was a total rip-off of an Ennio Morricone tune set against, mm, राही हूँ मैं, कहाँ तेरी मंजिल, कहाँ मेरी मंजिल, that kind of song. So a lot of nostalgia associated with, from Tarana to Gunmaster G9 before he became, of course, disco dancer and became that big star. And
When I was small, I used to actually, when I was small is something that is a politically correct thing to put. But I used to lie left, right, and center, just to seek attention. And it could be attention or to seek anything that I'm not getting otherwise. So in school, I had just floated that Mithun is my mama, my mother's younger brother. And it was totally bought. And people would flock into me, leaving the first boy and the first girl alone, and they would flock into me to hear the stories, and I would imagine and put all kinds of stuff on the table which would be gobbled up. Gautam, you have just introduced something, and I will take you back there. That, given that Chakraborty appeared in the horizon, which was dominated by the likes of Vinod Khanna, Rishi Kapoor, Amitabh Bachchan, and others, how do you think he was he was able to make space in that industry? He was in no way similar to these people. He was very different. So when there is a market dominance, how does a smaller player just come and seize his own space? How do you look at that?
I think in the last 70 years, if you were to look at uh, an actor trying to break into the industry, and when I say industry, I'm, for the sake of conversation here, I'm keeping it very specific to popular Hindi films. I don't think there has been a scenario which was as difficult as it would have been for Mr. Mithun Chakrabarti.
Yes.
And say maybe now, if you look at uh, in terms of her acting prowess, if you look at an early Kangana Ranaut, it would have been very difficult for people like them to make a space for them, because they can do what Mr. Bachchan, Rishi Kapoor, or Vinod Khanna was doing at that time. But would the trade think that the audience would accept this particular face and this particular personality in that dhacha? Was something that Mithun Chakrabarti really had to fight. I mean, it's very well documented that between his debut and the Gunmaster films, Vardat, and that period in between was very trying for him. And he has often spoken about that scenario where he really had to break into that market. And if you see the early films of Mithun Chakrabarti, where he has really, I mean, today, if somebody were to make that kind of a splash today, if you had a gun master kind of a character on one hand, you had Amne Samne, and you had Tarana, and you had Sitara at the same time, and you could easily blend into something like an Ashanti where you get a second lead with so much of panache that somebody like Rajesh Khanna and Parveen Babi, Zeenat Kamal, Shabana Azmi, they get completely overshadowed, and you also make your own in a film like Hum Panch, where you have Sanjeev Kumar in front of you, and you have somebody like a Nasiruddin Shah, who might not be a very big star, but he had that kind of a pedigree. Unlike Mithun Chakrabarti, even though Mithun Chakrabarti is a trained actor, like you would say. So I think for Mithunda, the people had to respond, and the kind of memories that Shantanu is evoking here of places like Shillong, where the film would run to packed houses, would somewhere give trade that feeling that it is okay to invest in these people. And I think somewhere a few actors have, and even uh, behind the scenes, if you see somebody like a Nadeem Shravan's melody is more or less the kind of melody which would have been very popular in the 80s. But how come they never managed to make that kind of a foray or dent? And I think somewhere the opening up of the markets after 91, the emergence of a Gulshan Kumar and T series, the push that somebody like a Mahesh Bhatt could give, are factors which helped people suddenly discover Nadeem Shravan, who had been in the running for, who had been in the industry for almost over a decade uh, by that time. So I think for Mithun Chakrabarti to make a mark would have been very difficult. And unlike, say, a Vinod Khanna's generation or a Shatrughan Sinha's generation, just a decade or in the early 70s, where you could play the second lead, you could play the parallel hero, एक term जो जमाने में बड़ा popular होता था, or you could play a very very suave villain like Shatrughan Sinha or Vinod Khanna, and then graduate to play the lead. This was not something, this was not a kind of a luxury which would have been bestowed upon Mithun Chakrabarti at that period. Similarly, later, if you see, up until the arrival of Manoj Bajpayee, you don't have any actor who went through that step by step progression. So even a Chunky Pandey, who was a very big star for a period of 2 3 years in the late
Hmm.
1980s, never really played the second hero. So I think the fact that Mithun Chakrabarti could make a mark for himself, and he could rewrite the trade in that sense, where the trade would make the Mithun kind of films. This is something which Dharamji was enjoying in the late 70s. Sorry, in the early 1970s, where you had Rajesh Khanna, you had Amitabh Bachchan, and you had Rishi Kapoor. But in between somewhere, Dharmender was that evergreen star who made his kind of films with his kind of production guys, his kind of people. So it was almost like a parallel industry which was emerging, which was an offshoot of that B action film. And that is the industry which Mithun Chakrabarti really cemented. So more than Jitendra having that parallel industry in Hindi films, I think it is Mithunda who managed to do that. And somewhere that those two lines were so close. And we'll talk about this a little later, that how he probably also had to pay a price for being who he was.
Oh, I'll bring you to this in a while. Shantanu and Dev, would you like to add anything before I go to Dev with my next question?
No, it's exactly what he Gautam says. Like he for the longest time, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, Hindi film heroes had a certain look. Like in the sense of the what came to be called the chocolate boy face.
Hmm.
So they had to be he-men, like you know tall, strapping he-men like Vinod Khanna or Dharmender, or people, or somebody like Rajesh Khanna. And so Mithun, I think, broke that thing.
Yeah.
He wasn't chocolate boy in the traditional Hindi film definition. He was entirely a different kettle of fish.
Yeah. Dev, my
Just
next question to you, is
I
to
just
you, and this will
I
have.
just want to add a I just want
Yes,
to
please.
add
I'm
a
so sorry.
tiny bit of just addition to it. It also seems that an industry like cinema industry, Bombay cinema industry, um, every decade, or one can, it's very difficult to really determine what is the period of that historical epoch. After some kind of period, that industry always looks for new formula, innovates, tries to innovate the given formula or come up with the new formula. And with that new formula, it becomes necessary for the industry to find a different kind of face which can carry out that innovation in the formula. That may be also seen as one of the reasons behind the emergence of some of the faces which were very unlike hero faces. uh, uh, I am a fan, like many of you, like all of us are fan of Mithun Chakrabarti, but in spite of that, I would not like to just uh, put it in that simple romantic term that it's very typical of Mithun Chakrabarti alone. Uh, in various phases, we have seen. We can't discredit that some of these actors we have named, against whom Mithun Chakrabarti had to make his presence felt, they didn't have their own share of struggle. If one thinks of Shatrughan Sinha, for example, or for that matter, even Amitabh Bachchan, uh, if one thinks of, we get to understand that they also had to go through uh, some kind of struggle. And it was precisely because of the innovations in their time, with the available formula in cinema, that they found uh, their spaces. And it's not that once they have, like Mithun Chakrabarti, once he found his space, and therefore he maintained that cinematic stereotype. He doesn't. There is always this process of becoming unbecoming, and that we
Hmm.
witness in the case of Mithun Chakrabarti very starkly. If we move through his filmographies, 70s, late 70s, 80s, 90s, first part of 90s is one story, and the second part of 90s is entirely different. When you had this, jala ke raakh kar dunga type of expression coming out very strongly. But this tiny addition.
Right. Dev, I will take you back to the to somewhat same question, but I would like you to look at it from a sociologist lens. That how do you feel Mithun Chakrabarti being the first subaltern face in mainstream cinema? uh, how did the society relate to him, or how did he in turn impact the society with his often loud narratives, and how did they manage to usher a change in the text and acceptance amid the snobbery and sophistication of his contemporaries? I'll tell you a little bit that where this question comes from. When I was studying Bachchan while writing my first book, I had a hunch that this angry young man thing, which I think all of us had at some point of time discussed or agreed or disagreed, whatever. But this angry young man thing was actually bubbling inside the society, inside the social beings, because post independence, there were lots of promises made to the middle class, and it was the middle class that suffered the more. There were yojanas for the poor, and the rich was protected. So there was probably an anger in the middle class, which reflected extremely well in Amitabh Bachchan, and he just soared. Do you see any such trend in Mithun Chakravarti films or anything that may have caused that kind of a bridge?
You rightly, I mean, you have already hinted some of the possibilities in the backdrop. Most of the time, when we think along this line, it takes us through social history of the time and the kind of questions which were in the air, to which most of the mediums of communication were trying to respond to. So, as you have already hinted, 1970s is an interesting time,
Mhm.
is intriguing time in our socio-political history of independent India, when we witnessed uh, some kind of loss of faith in the that proverbial midnight children's dream. One can say, in many ways, Nehruvian tryst with India had come to a halt for various reasons. Given the vested interests at the helm of affairs, then it was a time of brewing movements all around and socio-political churning that brought about a massive mobilization of oppositional forces, uh, which also amounted to what many of us have understood as a black episode in the theater of India's democracy, namely the emergency. Uh, this kind of quick historical background allows us to uh, recall, in order to fathom the reason and rationality behind the emergence of cinemas in the 1970s, leading us through 1980s. Uh, we had already seen, it's not that it's happening only with Mithun Chakravarti. Before that, we had already seen Satyajit Ray's Pratidwandi in 1970, exactly, which centralized youth's anxiety and critical outlook. There were many hard-hitting realist drama of Shyam Benegal. Ankur had 1974, Nishant, Manthan, Bhumika, or even Adur Gopal Krishnan's 1977 drama Kodiyattam in Malayalam. We were already witness to all those things. They were revealing the novel possibility for Indian society in which utter disillusionment, frustration, and helplessness were to pave the way for the resurgence of the youth in whatever possible manner. Uh, in summary, the youth were willing to take up the mantle and create a critically sound, intellectually and emotionally refreshing new dramas against the dream of the Yoda that were beginning to metamorphose into some kind of uh, socio-political hysteria, so to say. Uh, that's the context in which many imageries of youth in popular Hindi cinema emerged. You have already mentioned it was predominantly the Vijay type,
Mhm.
which was very unwilling to laugh and enjoy life while taking on the muscats of an RI dream or dream gone haywire. Yet we clapped for Vijay in Zanjeer and then in Diwar in 1975. We needed another kind of angry young man at that point in time who could be willing to swoon in the tune of the time, giving us a Hindi cinematic feel of Elvis Presley type, fight moments like Bruce Lee style, and yet earthy in language, demeanor, complexion, and so on. If we call it a rise of the subaltern, we may in some sense, but we also need to qualify it further by suggesting that the subalternity of his characters, Mithun's characters, was not fossilized. It was not immune to the local and global influences.
Mhm.
Stylishly loud, clear dialogues with instant appeal to the masses, and total kitsch of colors available on the then cultural horizon. This was a way Mithun found a way straight to our hearts. Um, as we started with our nostalgic attachment, let me give more personal touch when I say some of these things, which may appear slightly abstract. When we were growing up as boys in the small towns of northern India, I connected with the fragments of Mithun's filmography. Uh, it was, I mean, one was a child, and therefore all kind of musicals found instant uh, acceptance, and therefore I mentioned Tarana. But this continues in the early 1980s too, and hence we get to watch some of those films which were morsels for child for in our childhood, such as the one which Shantanu mentioned, Sun Sajna. Likewise, Ustadi Ustad Se, or even this super hit Pyar Jhukta Nahi, which was a little funny, but it was like those days we were all humming the songs of Pyar Jhukta Nahi. We should also not forget to mention a Basu Chatterjee classic, Shauqeen, that we were not allowed to watch as children until we stumbled upon it in a late night show on Doordarshan much later. Uh, Besides, there was already an established genre of crime thrillers with suave and gentle hero, either as a police officer or as a curious man in love solving the mystery puzzle with the some kind of fumbling effects. Mithun, in all this, we also see that Mithun Chakrabarti characters were trying to project some kind of manhood with endearing expressions of intimate, curious, puzzle-solving hero. Even in some of those films you have mentioned, Gautam mentioned Bhayanak, Suraksha, Vardat, and my favorite amongst them was Shakti Samant's Khwab or Beshak. I don't know whether this Koi Shak, the dialogue emerged from Beshak, that is yet to be explored. The trend continued through the decade of 1980s with more insistence on the aggression of the man who tended to be soft-hearted, in spite of a critically acclaimed, once again, a film that you mentioned, Bapu's, it was anti-feudalism drama in Hum Panch, and an offbeat love story of an earthy couple in Sitara. So in all these things, I mean, this is to just figure out as to why he finds acceptance, or in the presence of all other actors around him. This was interesting to note that it was during such a stint of the man called Mithun that the characters he plays begin to add on new elements, such as the then popular disco, or as I mentioned, Bruce Lee style of martial moves. It was clear that the angry young man wants to enjoy life with very contemporary fun or frivolous components while fighting for the emotions and injustice. Uh, it was important for the crusader man to swoon and croon, to enchant and exorcise, to bleed in order to beat the villains, and sweat in order to enjoy life. This was the broad spectrum of Mithun's manhood that had already made it possible to establish him as an endearing dancer, loving lover, angry man to take on any injustice. This background can give us an idea about the multifacetedness of the angry young man, which was somehow missing from the scene in some of those predominant variety of angry young man, where we did not find the characters of angry young man slipping into those liminal moments of living everyday life. This angry young man was emotionally flirting with mother figure endlessly in spite of a lady love, be it in disco dancer or even Kasam Paida Karne Wale Ki. With Mithun's characters in cinematic narratives, we were in a quest of new dramas as much as in the process of finding a new manhood, in which expression of anger was not dissociated from dance moves, sparkling lights, and kitsch of colors. This is what I would probably say was in the whole spectrum,
Lovely.
which
Yeah.
particularly in the early
I think
stage.
Dave,
I
we
think
have given a
one of the
lot of food
things
for thought. Yes, Shantanu and Gautam, if you
one
want
of
to
the
add, because I
one
will
of the
have a
things that
question.
also happened, and I think Gautam would be very aware of this and will be able to articulate it much better, is the fact that the 80s witnessed a certain urbanization, when it came to the shift of populations from uh, hinterlands to cities, and which drastically changed the contours of film watching and film and correspondingly, because the contours of film watching changed, the filmmaking also changed. So I remember actually going to watch films like Watan Ke Rakhwale, which had Dharmender and Sunil Dutt and Mithun Chakravarti. And I remember people rooting for Mithun Chakravarti more than they did so for Dharmender and Sunil Dutt, because like I got the feeling, looking back, it's all hindsight. I got the feeling that there had been a dramatic change in the uh, in people who made up the audience at that point of time, because of this urbanization, this shift from rural semi-urban areas to the big cities. And that had a that is where a hero, the previous non-hero face who made it really big was Amitabh Bachchan. You look at his early films, one would never have thought that Amitabh Bachchan would be able to make it in an industry where the Dharmenders and the Vinod Khannas make it. But I think by the 80s, the whole audience had evolved because of this urbanization. A uh, certain look had come into the movies which catered to Mithun Chakravarti's sort of thing. But that's just a uh,
Hunch.
hunch. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phase also, the 80s. I think a little mix of this, what many of us often don't think about so much, but of late I've just been thinking about this aspect. Yes, Shantanu has a very valid point that there's a shift and there's a certain sense of urbanization taking place. But what is also happening with each year is that cinemas, the number of physical theaters were also increasing in that period. So, A, you had people shifting from smaller towns to the city. So, your kind of films which were being made were different, or there was a certain sense of aspirational value attached to that. But at the same time, there was cinemas being popping up all over the country. So, the same filmmakers also have to make films which will go in. Now, this is something which we see today. 10, 15 years ago, you had you completely stopped making films for a certain kind of audience which now watches the South Indian dubbed films on TV channels. The kind of market that these dubbed films have in Hindi speaking areas, just flip through any TV channel today which has a film channel offshoot, and they have these n number of films being dubbed and being played. I think that is for the kind of audience which was enjoying the Vatan Ke Rakhwales of the world. But they don't get to see that. See, today, if you look at Hollywood, I may get an Expendables to enjoy that kind of a feeling all over again. But I'm not getting an Expendables kind of a film here today with, say, bring me a film which has Sanjay Dutt, Sunny Deol, Anil Kapoor, and, maybe Jackie Shroff put in together. There'll be a huge market for that. Who knows? But I think somewhere what Mithun also, furthering what Dave very articulately put it, that these were factors that made Mithun popular with the audiences. But also, I think somewhere Mithun Chakrabarti became the one man industry who could be in Bombay, but you could use him to make films which will be released in places where other usual Bombay cinema fare will never go. I think that balance, Mithun Chakrabarti was at the right place at the right time, and also credit to him for creating this market. Dharamji could have done this and also did this to some extent in the 70s, and then in the 1990s or early 2000s, Sunny Deol managed to do that. That even in up and post Qadar and say up until 2010s, you could still make a Sunny Deol film and have a market for it in certain places. I think
Even Govinda, I think, no,
with
Gautam?
yeah, yeah.
Even Govinda.
So
Govinda.
Govinda to some extent, but also see, I think somewhere the industry got a little confused of how to use the likes of Mithun and Govinda. They are also be blamed to some extent for that. For example, a Govinda could never come to terms with the fact that he could play the good, great second lead in Tal, or he could play Chunni Babu in Devdas and rewrite the zeitgeist. Today, Govinda might not make the same mistake. Mithun Chakravarti refused Iruvar. Mani Ratnam had offered Prakash Raj's role to him. He refused that because he did not want to shave his head for a scene or something. But then see what Mani Ratnam does with Mithunda in Guru.
Guru.
Now imagine that if at that time you would have taken that decision, you could have been somebody else. But that's again, like Shantanu said, and they've also pointed out, and you and I both will agree. This is the luxury of hindsight that many of us would not have had at that time.
No, but
One question. Sorry.
in spite of all this, I mean, Mithun Chakrabarti's repertoire has been always, I mean, I don't know how, was he doing it consciously or not? I don't know the logic behind it, but such wide spectrum of cinema. Say, for example, we could have never imagined that the same Mithun Chakrabarti who was doing all uh, these popular flicks would do so wonderful in Swami Vivekananda. I mean, such a powerful performance he delivers in Swami
Yeah,
Vivekananda.
yeah.
One can
I think
never get
to some
over.
extent, the reason for this wide variety of films that somebody like a Mithun Chakravarti had was also probably, I think the industry has been a little unfair when it comes to talents such as Govinda and Mithun Chakravarti, specifically these two people, and to some extent, I would also add Sridevi, because you did not know what to do with them. You were in so much of awe of their personality. Like this is what happened with Mr. Bachchan. Now, if you see the likes of Anurag Kashyap grew up idolizing Amitabh Bachchan, but when they actually get an opportunity to work with Amitabh Bachchan, I don't think they can let go of Diwars and Kaliyas in their mind. You're in too much of awe of him. And I think this is where Balki excelled, especially with Chini Kam, because he was an Amitabh Bachchan fan, he still is. But the way he managed to look beyond that, or a Raj Santoshi could do with a Khaki, where you take the personality of these guys, but don't get awed by them. I think today the same problem is Shah Rukh is suffering from the same problem, and for no fault of his, that people who want to work with him can think of a great idea with Shah Rukh, but when it comes to execution, I think looking at him or working with him or trying to keep pace with him, like Anand Rai's Zero is a fairly interesting film, but I think somewhere you get so awed by the Shah Rukh Khan personality that you really can't take it to the next extent. And I think that Mithun Chakravarti suffered. And also, I think somewhere those entire rumors of him and Sridevi and the fact that Sridevi became such a big star, I think Mithun suffered getting A-list films after that, because Chandni is an example I always like to quote. Vinod Khanna's role, just imagine Mithun Chakrabarti in that, and it would have been a far fantastic film. I'm not saying Vinod Khanna did not do a great job, but the reason, because it had Sridevi, you could never have had somebody like a Mithun in that film. And I think that somewhere is also the problem of the industry. And like Dave was mentioning, it's very interesting that Ghayal was originally his film. I mean, in fact, Dharamji requested him ki, will you part with the script? So yes, there were people writing for Mithun, and yes, there were people trying to push the envelope when it came to Mithun also.
When you three were talking, I was doing a small research to figure, because something that they've said just put in a question in my mind, that the Bengal Naxal movement happened in 1967-69. That was the burning time, and a decade after that. And Mithun's first film Mrigoya was 1977. Do you think Mrigoya and Mithun's look and his look after in the films after that, do you think somewhere it had something to do with public memory of the Naxal movement? Because the Naxal movement may have gone wherever it could. However, the basis of the movement, from which the ideology of the movement was equality, eradicating the inequality between the rich and the poor, and stopping the corruption, stopping uh, the exploitative means that made a poor poorer. Do you think public memory responded to Mithunda from that perspective? I mean, it's just a hypothesis I'm putting across to all of you before I go to Shantanu.
Dave, would you like to take that? I don't really know. I, I think I don't think the pan-Indian audience was pan-Indian film watching audience was so much aware of the Naxal movement and its ramification in terms of Mithun's look or anything.
No,
They just knew
Shantanu,
that.
the reason why I asked this is that you see, the Naxal movement, the main participants were the intelligentsia, the young intelligentsia, the best of the students. Presidency College was burning.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
from that perspective, I had asked the question because pan India, the intelligentsia had responded, and they were, they were jumping into it and passing comments if they couldn't pick up the arms. It was an armed conflict.
I think Koral, you've really summed it up. I don't think that the intelligentsia liked Hindi films. I mean, in my
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
Okay.
I recall chatting with Mansoor Khan for my book on Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, and Mansoor is Nasir Hussein's son. I mean, here is a guy who said that मैं same film के साथ 13 super hit फिल्में बनाऊंगा, and आपके घर में you have people like Majroo Sahab or Shami Kapoor walking in, walking out, Vijay Anand, R.D. Burman, and Mansoor had never seen a Guru Dutt film till very late in his life. He never saw films. In fact, he had utter disdain for Hindi films. And similarly, if you look at Aditya Bhattacharya, who was making Raak parallelly with Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak, and in fact, Aditya used to boast that Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak is going to be one of the biggest flops, and Raak would be the film which will rewrite Hindi cinema, and it will make people discover Amir Khan. So the point I'm trying to make, I think, the response to the Naxal movement was more in films that Salim Javed wrote. I think somewhere they tried to urbanize it, with keeping the Hindi film audience in mind. But the burning issues, if you were to take of any revolutionary movement, so to speak of, were answered by those kind of films. Uh, जमाने को दिखाना, sorry, जमाना, नया जमाना of धर्म जी, and शराफत छोड़ दी मैंने, that kind of dialogue bazi, or if you see Admi or Insan in that period. So I think, yes, the response was from intelligentsia, but it was petered down to these films. Also, I think somewhere, if Mithun's look or Mithun's persona had that kind of resonance, he would not have been that big a star, because the connection that some small town person or a film viewer has with a star who he or she thinks represents him or her, I don't think the industry setup is as such that they will go beyond a point. And case in point being Manoj Bajpayee. Manoj Bajpayee's connection. Manoj Bajpayee is a fantastic actor. Or
Absolutely.
look at KK, or look at
NN.
Rajeshwari in that sense, or Rameshwari. I mean, it's the whole landscape is peppered with such instances where the connection is so good. I mean, look at somebody like a Pawan Malhotra. Industry में there is a saying that Pawan Malhotra is a bad luck charm. अगर आप उनको ले लेंगे तो ना आपकी फिल्म बनेगी ना आपका टीवी शो बनेगा. I was writing a TV show and I used to do that in the early 2000s, and it was an episodic thing where we could get the main characters were the same, but people would we could have an ensemble cast. Every time you pitched Pawan Malhotra, the big channels would just put their foot down. And so I think somewhere that response came from the intelligentsia, but that was more to do with, say, a Sahir writing a song like जिंदगी हंसने गाने के लिए है, पल दो पल, उसमें एक लाइन है, जहां सच ना चले वहां झूठ सही, जहां हक ना मिले वहां लूट सही.
लूट सही.
So, और him writing in मजदूर, जब हम मेहनत कश जब अपना हक मांगेंगे, एक फूल नहीं, एक बाग नहीं, सारी दुनिया मांगेंगे. I think that is more of a response from the likes of Sahir or Kehfi Azmi or even Majroo Saab, putting it here or there, or Rishida trying to put it. I don't think Mithun's connection or Mithun's background with his Naxar ideology, I think that was only limited to him doing that K. Abbas film. Otherwise, I don't think he even used that to his advantage or his disadvantage.
Hmm.
I nobody can disagree with this. I mean, cinema has its own logic, and therefore, but once again, some social history bit, if I have to add, I would tell you that when I was in class 7, a lot of boys from my class, we all believed strongly that this guy was a Naxalite, and something which he could not achieve through his participation in that movement, is trying to get from his cinema. And that is why some of these films, not only Mrigaya, that is obviously in line with this Naxalite background, given his tribal character who takes up to violence because of the injustice. His wife in that film was killed or something.
Hmm.
But then it's not only in Mrigaya, it's also later on in 80s we see something like Hum Panch had many other actors, but it was like that aggressive young man who is going to do something against this whole feudal structure in the village society. Or for that matter, I can't get over with this. It was with such a strong hangover of that so-called offbeat cinema, something like Jag Utha Insan. It was a very sweet, beautiful, very smooth film, which again gave that sense. I mean, in between there would be there. Therefore, I was telling you about this wider spectrum of choices he makes in terms of doing characters and doing cinema. That always gave us a sense that in between all this disco dance, he's also doing some of these things which are related to his Naxalite past. Obviously, these things cannot be verified, so it's only at the level of our shared
Yeah.
belief, the folklore related to Mithun Chakrabarti amongst the audience that I'm sharing you with. But I agree, cinema has larger logic, and therefore one can discover
Yeah,
even
I
more.
mean, when you were talking last time, it just came to my mind that, and I was not trying to pitch Mithun as from the side of the intelligentsia. Not that I'm pushing this at all. It just
Yeah.
came to my mind that maybe from the other side, where we were the society, the intelligentsia was trying to stand by those who had been wronged, and Mithun probably had fitted in somewhere in that that face of the wrong, the oppressed. So I had just floated that question.
I
Shantanu,
think, Koral, the point this issue, this point that you're making now, when I think about it, is quite visible in Mithun's character from Ramesh Sippy's Bhrashtachar. I mean, it seems like the guy who has moved from, for the want of a better term, one revolution to another silent one, and it catches him in between. And I mean, you can see sparks of what he desires and what he understands about the reality of society, so to speak. So I think that could be the only highlight of that film now in my mind if I look back.
probably I'm so glad that we are doing this conversation. You know, Shantanu, coming to you, I would request you to tell the audience about Chakraborty's contribution in Bengali cinema, which of course began with Mrigaya, but popular media and public memory is more biased towards films like Troi. So,
Yeah, like
why
it's
would
the
want
case
to?
with, yeah, it's the case with the uh, I would say a dialogue like লাথ মারবো এখানে লাশ পড়বে ওখানে লাশ পড়বে
Last
শ্মশানে
word by Shashane.
Shashan, like I'll kick you here and your dead body will land up in the cremation ground. So that kind of, or act chobole chobi, which means like I'll just bite you once and you'll become a photograph, and like which is a very nuanced way of saying
Cobra.
that I'm a cobra, and I'll bite you once and you'll become no more than a photograph on the wall. So those of course were, but then I think in Bengali cinema he got the scope that didn't come his way very much in Hindi films. Like even his best Hindi films that we have talked about, be it Hum Panch or Prem Pratigya, or the ones where he played a different sort of, not his regular thing. Bengali cinema gave that to him. He started off, in fact, I think the finest scene of his career. In fact, just I was just looking at this piece that I had written, and it's fascinating how Mrinal Sen got uh, to cast Mithun Chakravarti. Like he was looking for a good body, somebody who, because this character had to be without clothes, just a lungi sort of thing, a dhoti sort of thing he would be wearing. So he was looking for somebody who would be and who would be dark skinned, and he just couldn't find anybody of that look and face in his thing, in his circle. So he actually, and then he remembered that when in 1973 he had attended a FTII graduation thing. One of the students there was horsing around, making jokes and all of that, but he couldn't for his life remember his name or anything. So he sent a telegram to KK Mahajan, the cinematographer KK Mahajan, who was also there on that day. And I think Alkazi had. So when Mithun was doing all this horsing around, and Mrinal Sen had just asked, who is this guy? So and Alkazi had said, some wannabe actor, passing out this Mithun Chakravarti or something. So, and Mrinal Sen didn't remember anything of this. So he just wrote to KK Mahajan, looking for FTIA graduate of 73 batch, tall, dark, well-built, Bengali. Name starts probably with M. Catch hold of him and send a recent photo immediately. I think it must have been one of the most important missives of Indian cinema. Like imagine Mrinal Sen. But and Mrinal Sen actually took him on for his dark body, dark looks, and all of that, because he would fit the character. Because time and again the camera is focusing on his body, and it had an important role to play. Subsequently, of the 3 national awards that he has won, 2 came in Bengali films, Mrigaya, and I think Tahader Kotha is probably his greatest performance, and his greatest scene, like one scene that I think anybody would be, any other star would be loath to do, comes in Tahader Kotha, when, like where he's playing this uh, freedom fighter who has spent some time in an asylum and is getting released in a free India, which is not free in the way that he as a freedom fighter had visualized. So he's constantly struggling in his mind to come to terms with this new India, the free India. And so there's this scene where, and he's almost, he's lost his mental balance sort of thing. He sits under a tree and babbles along, and then this guy comes in asking, and then gets into a conversation and asks this character, you know uh, so what do you think of the state of the nation, sort of question it was, কি দেখছেন আপনি দেশের ব্যাপারে কি দেখছেন, something like that. And Mithun's, and the character's response is just lifts his leg and farts. I don't
Oh, wow.
think, any other star, and this was at a time when he was at the peak of his career, and he's acting in this, and it's such a tremendous statement on the state of the nation, to be asking a character what is the state of the nation, and then this character who is a superstar, who is a disco dancer, who is a, actually has, and I think it takes, and his whole Bengali film thing, though people quote his MLA Fatakesto or Troi, those are the kind of films that get referred to, but we forget that some of his finest, not even his finest Hindi films have that kind of range which he brought to, say Mrigaya, a Tahader Kotha. Then there was this film called Shukno Lanka, like which is about uh, this character actor, like extras, the life of an extra in cinema, who is just picked up at random because the director of the so this is about this is a film about a intellectual director actually wanting to make a film, and to prove his point that he can make a star of anybody, you know mm, uh, picks up this extra character, extra thing, and gives him the main role. And Mithun Chakravarti is so perfect in that, it has to be seen how he sort of sheds all his star trappings for that role. Like here is the superstar who is uh, conveying his lack of confidence. Will I be able to pull off the role of a main character? Then there are these philosophical exchanges that he has with his wife every night. The only source of joy that he has in his very humdrum, very downbeat life is that every evening he and his wife take a Tonga ride on near Victoria Memorial, and he talks about life and what's life all about. There's this wonderful scene where he's asked to shake a leg to that classic Kishore Kumar song, Shing Nahi Tubu Naam Tar Shingo. And here is Mithun Chakravarti, a master dancer. You should actually see that scene just to see how he conveys that na Amito, I can't dance, like I can't for my, and then he is forced, and you can make that if I were to be asked to dance to a that's the way I would be, because I'm not sure of my, I've got two left
The
feet. And for
hesitation
Mithun
on his
to be
body.
uh, the for Mithun Chakravarti to be doing that, for one, playing an extra who has no charm of his own, who is not sure of his ability to pull off the role, who has to actually act as if he can't dance. So I think Bengali cinema time and again gave him the kind of option which Hindi cinema didn't. Not even the best of Hindi cinema actually gave him that kind of, like Kal Purush. There's another, I think Buddhadev Dasgupta, apart from Tahader Kotha, in fact, he won the national award for Tahader Kotha also. He won the national award for Mrigaya. The third national award was for praying Ramakrishna Paramahansa in Vivekananda. But if you actually watch Kalpurush, it's a role that's so removed from his persona, his star persona, that it you can only watch, and because it's abstract, there are no dialogues. It's you know it's a role that just has his face, and on that face, his face is like if Tader Kotha, his face is a map of the disillusionment of the country. You can actually see the country reflected in that face in Tader Kotha. In Kalpurush, it's a disillusionment of a man who has failed everybody around him. So it's a man who is coming to terms with his own failures, with his inability to relate to his son, and all of that. So I think, time and again, then there was this film called Titli, Rituparna. He actually
Italy.
got to work with some of the best names in Indian cinema when it came to Bengali cinema. In Titli, again, that was a role that was nominated for Best Actor. He didn't win it that year, but again, that role, or no, Shuman Ghosh's Noble Chore. Like here he is playing a guy who has no idea of who Rabindranath Tagore is, let alone, you know, who actually let alone the fact that he's got hold of that Nobel Prize that's been stolen from Shanti Niketan, and he is on a journey to give it back to the authorities. And through that, the filmmaker sort of makes his comment on the hypocrisies that sort of, and again, as a villager who has no, who thinks Robi Thakur mane Thakur means God. For him, it's like that. So I think Bengali cinema gave him the kind of uh, opportunities when it came to when it came to the characters, which I think was lacking even in the best of Hindi cinema. Like of course, MLA Fatakesto or Minister Fatakesto, or Hirogiri, or of course Troi is there. A lot of these were, like are the more popular ones, but I think he actually made it count when it came to his appearances in Bengali cinema. It's a different, absolutely different world that it's a, like it's a different beat altogether. There's no comparison with what he has done in the rest of his career. You know, and that's where I marvel at the guy. The guy who's done Tahadir Kotha and Brigoya and Kalpurush actually also has done those Uti films, like the
Rav and
26,
Raj.
30 films on that, like he used to have 3 or 4 sets lined up. So that also, I guess by that time he had realized that there was nobody in Hindi cinema who'd actually cash in on, who actually got the ability to tap into his potential. So he might as well make some money out of the thing, and he acted in. It's a genre of films that needs to be studied. Why, like how the house of making those films, the whys of. But Bengali cinema, I think, gave him the kind of, you know,
Rootedness, maybe.
uh, gave him the kind of potential, the kind of thing which he didn't have in Hindi cinema. I don't think the Hindi filmmakers actually realized the potential this guy had as a performer. Like beyond that, they were more bound by his star image than
True.
in Bengali cinema. He actually could discard his star image altogether, and that particular scene in Tahadir Kotha is, for me, the epitome of any star actor to be able to do that with that kind of conviction. I think it's takes a
True. I will bring you to the last question of this session, but and it's criminal not to discuss his leading ladies and the music of the typical Metunda films. But before I go there, I would invite Gautam to go back to that thing that you had just initiated and left it with a touch, the the perils of being Mitunda, what he suffered for being who he
Yeah,
was.
I think what Shantanu was mentioning about his foray or his Bengali cinema lineage, I think somewhere Hindi cinema and popular Hindi cinema, I would feel, is bound by certain time gaps. Like if you see, there is a very big difference between what Hindi cinema was all about between say 1987 and 1988. Because up until 1987, you could not look beyond Anil Kapoor. You thought that Anil Kapoor is the next big thing amongst his own contemporaries, and Bachchan was seeming out of space, out of place. And the next year, when you have Qayamat se Qayamat tak, somebody like a Juhi Chawla or an Amir Khan emerges, and suddenly everything changes. I think somewhere 2 or 3 guys who, in my mind, were actually big stars in every sense of the word, but never really got that nice embrace from the industry when it came to what would you like to do, the
Hmm.
kind of films that you would like to do. Dharmendra, Govinda, and in between them is Mithun Chakravarti. Their successes opened up each and every door for them. They might have worked with all leading directors, but not at the point where they would have ideally liked to work, or these directors could have really done something far more interesting with them. So I think that ended up becoming one of the big perils of being Mithun Chakravarti. His popularity, I think also somewhere he never really pursued certain things in Hindi cinema, because I feel that after hearing what Shantanu had says, I think he must be getting his kicks or his regular dose from there. That actor within would be getting satisfied playing that kind of stuff. And here you were doing just the kind of thing, because somewhere I think Mithun Chakrabarti also understood that it's not going to last for a very long time. Every star after Rajesh Khanna has understood that very clearly, that it's not going to last beyond a specific time. But I think somewhere the fact that there was always a Bachchan to compete with, suddenly Kumar Gaurav had a hit, so Mithun had to compete with Kumar Gaurav. Okay, then in between somewhere you had Nasiruddin Shah coming up with Jane Bhi Do Yaro, even though the film might not have done great business. Even Ravi Baswani would have been a threat for somebody like Mithun Chakravarti. Emergence of Govinda would have been a threat for Mithun Chakravarti. Suddenly, Amir Khan, Salman Khan coming is a threat for Mithun Chakravarti. Or somebody like a Sunny Deol deciding to do a Dakat is also taking away from Mithun Chakravarti. I think Mithun understood that terrain very well and never really had any great expectations from the trade. But having said that, I feel that the trade owes it to people like Govinda and Mithun, that you think of them in something which will be befitting of their talent because they're stars. And why I say they're stars is that what is the definition of star? For me, star, amongst other parameters, is also the person who attracts the most producers or directors to come to them. So if you look at Amir Khan's box office record from say 1988, after Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, till say Lagan or Dil Chahta Hai, you will be surprised that the guy has less than 5 super hits in that period. You can actually count them on your fingertips. But the fact that Amir was the first port of call for each and every filmmaker. So you can think of Sajan, you can think of Dilwale, you can think of Hum Aapke Hain Kaun. All these guys went to Amir Khan first. When Amir refused, they went to somebody else. So today, the fact that people still think of Ranbir Kapoor as a star, even though he might not have had so many box office hits, is because he's still the first port of call. In that aspect, I feel that Govinda and Mithun never really became the first port of call for a lot of films. You could say that you could not fit a certain character, a certain suave character. You can't imagine Govinda to play that. But you can imagine Govinda to do a lot of things. That is something which the filmmaker of that era did not do. And I think now is a great time to look back and see that this is the price you had to pay. And of course, once you become a successful pair with somebody, like in the case of Mithun Chakrabarti, and we're talking about leading ladies. So the success that he enjoyed with Sri Devi, and I think Sri Devi's trajectory was as such that you could not think of any star in front of her, a male star. Even Amitabh Bachchan had to think twice before doing Khuda Gawar. You could not think of a male actor getting the kind of space that he used to with Sri Devi. But having said that, you could have still thought of something interesting with Mithun and Sri Devi. You never did. Similarly, in the case of Govinda, if you see, he could never strike that kind of a balance. So I think that was the price that Mithun had to pay. But after hearing what Shantanu said, I think he didn't mind it beyond a point because he was getting to do what he was getting to do back in Kolkata. And then later in the late 90s, when he had that entire Ooty industry happening, him and TLV Prasad, just putting an assembly line, I think the guy must have had a good laugh in that period.
Yeah, I think with Mithun Chakravarti, one of the things that also happened is he never had that free run when it came to being the top star of like, because by the time he came into the picture in a big way, 82 when Disco Dancer happened and he was starting to rise. By that time, as Gautam mentioned, Kumar Gaurav had happened. Betab had happened with Sunny Deol. Anil Kapoor and Jackie Shroff were bearing down on him. And by the time the decade wound up, a whole new crop of actors had come up. He never, and to his luck, box office luck didn't work out. Some of the big films, Boxer was touted to be as the next big Mithun Chakrabarti film. It bombed. And then Bhraштাচার and Yugandhar. I remember the kind of press promotion that Bhraштাচার, Ramesh Sippy going with Mithun and Rekha, or Yugandhar, which was a sort of remake of that Anthony Quinn film, sort of, I forgot the name of the Anthony Quinn film.
The Lion of the Desert. Yeah.
Land of the Desert.
And it's N. Chandra after Tezab, so and Narasimha.
So you see, so Boxer had him as in his element as a sort of boxer guy. That bombs. Ramesh Sippy's biggest failure, Bhraштাচার, in terms of both in terms of commercial and the critical aspect of the film. Yugandhar, N. Chandra coming up with a huge scale and that film bombing. I think all of that must have played a role in sort of making Mithun Chakravarti also skeptical about, and then saying, "Chalo yaar, let me at least make my hotels in Ooty work out." So,
Anything to add, Dave? And also add a little bit. I know we are beyond time, but if you could add a little bit on his music, we must talk a little bit, whatever it is, on the music of his films. Shantanu is already smiling. Let's start with Dave, sitting quiet for a long time.
I understand trade may have its very significant role. It is very important in an industrial endeavor like cinema. So actors, or for that matter, other stakeholders in any production would be uh, quite particular about the trade aspect. But then for me, as an admirer of cinema buff, or even a social scientist who is interested in understanding the interface of cinema and society, or cinema and politics, cinema and history, and so on and so forth. I believe beyond trade, irrespective of flop or hit, uh, the filmography of an actor becomes a kind of quasi biography of some sort, and that gives us that can provide a sense of what was going on. And it's not that yes, there can be this kind of conjecture about how to milk the opportunity, if one can say bluntly, but then it's not that it's not that he was not doing other kind of stuff. For example, when you come to the question of all those quirky titles in 1990s, we know that the seeds of those titles are very much available in 1980s. Some of those strange kind of, like Kasam Paida Karne Wali Ki was a film in 1980s. It was sometime in 1984, I believe. But we tend to think of Kasam Paida Karne Wale Ki in with the series of films he was doing in late 1990s, like Chandal, Gundaraj, with all those Bengali cinema kind of dialogue coming in Hindi as well. Most of those productions, very low budget. It seemed very low budget, very tacky in many regards, but then quite popular with the masses. And by this time, this was 1990s. By this time, once again, if I have to reflect retrospectively, many of us who were admirers in our childhood of Mithun Chakrabarti, we had migrated from those small towns, looking for better opportunity for education and all. Some of us who did not migrate and had to languish in the same space, um, which were not available for that kind of rapid urbanization for various reasons. They were not attractive locations for new industries to come up, or they were going through some kind of political regime which did not allow any kind of. This is roughly in Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh kind of places, Rajasthan. So not so much of Rajasthan though, and Madhya Pradesh, less of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. So many of those who languished there, cursing fate, destiny, or accepting any of those positions just for the sake of employment, they were watching probably all those 1990s films and making sure that they do whatever business possible. Not only that, also in the midst of all those things, we get to see some of those films which were treated as flops, but then they had good. For example, if one watches Boxer, in spite of all the, I mean, it's a different time, so obviously in terms of technological efficacy, it may not satisfy, but then one is amazed by the effort an actor is trying to make. Likewise, I don't know about the trade report of a film, JP Datta film, Gulami, which was in 1985, I guess.
It's a huge film, yeah.
Yeah, and such a wonderful performance in spite of the then muscular, powerful Dharmender, and Nasiruddin Shah was already established as the actor, the performing actor, if not star. And yet Mithun Chakrabarti, with that small bit of role, does wonderful job in Gulami. So I would say that whatever is happening in late 90s, the reflections of those films are coming up in 80s as well, but they are coming up with other kind of stuff, with other kind of films that he's doing, and probably therefore some of us who were watching those films with critical eyes, we were not totally disillusioned with the Mithun Chakrabarti. It's only in 1990s, late 1990s, that we begin to rethink our our admiration of this wonderful actor.
No, no,
Uh,
I absolutely love that series of films. There's something about them, I think that period of films actually needs to be, somebody needs to really study the whys and hows of that. Like, for example, I keep talking about Ed Wood as a director. Uh, some of the worst films ever made. You know have been attributed to Ed Wood, and a film like Gunda is as classic as Plan 9 from Outer Space, Ed Wood's Plan 9 from Outer Space, or Glenn and Glenda, which are actually touted as, so much so that the director had a biopic made on him. Tim Burton made Ed Wood, the biopic of Ed Wood. So I think, in, I have never dismissed that thing. There's something there happening there, which maybe we,
No,
with our
yeah,
intellectual.
the point is very well put by both Dev and Shantanu, that you're not disillusioned. You're somewhere feeling. See, the whole thing is industry operates on a lot of nonsense. Let's be honest about that. They dismissed your पाप को जलाकर राख कर दूंगा या पाप का अंत in the 80s. Then they dismissed all Mithun Chakravarti films in the 90s. And if you look at the revival of your Gajni, your Wanted, your Dabang,
Oh
and
God.
your Rowdy Rathore, is just trying to be this. I think
Yeah,
somewhere the fact that you could hear a Mithun dialogue like "Koi shak" ya "Tere naam ka kutta palu" from the 80s and miss that in the 90s. That is why you wanted to watch films like Jallad or
mm,
Ravan or Dalal or Ravan Raj. Because you need that. Even today, why does Setmax or whatever channel plays Nayak ad nauseum? It still makes money on that. The fact is that
yeah,
somebody is watching it, and people who are watching it are missing Amitabh Bachchan playing Kalia. You don't want Amitabh Bachchan to play the suave, sophisticated guy every time you see Kaun Banega Crorepati. You want that some kind of a throwback. इसीलिए वो कहीं ना कहीं आता है and the industry, it's not like this Rowdy Rathore is a revival which happened suddenly. Hardcore mainstream A-list guys like the Chopras were trying this with Tashan. I am
mm,
telling you, if Tashan was a hit, Dabang would have never happened. The fact that Dabang was a hit is largely because of the director, because the director could get certain kind of earthiness which Vijay Acharya could not manage in Tashan. So I think that entire phase is fun. थोड़ा सा अगर प्रोडक्शन वैल्यू अच्छा हो जाता ना, अगर
mm,
आपको कोई गोली मार रहा है और आप साइकिल के पीछे छुपने की बजाय किसी गाड़ी के पीछे छुपते, maybe people would have not dissed it completely. But yeah, I mean, that's also fun and you need that. But if you ask me as a huge Mithun fan, and I'm sure that most of us would agree here, I would rather watch Ashanti and him saying, तेरे नाम का कुत्ता पालूं या ऊपर से 6 इंच कम कर दूंगा, than Ravan Raj or the Gundas. Because for me, that is still the classic Mithun fun. And it's very interesting. Like Dave was pointing out something about connecting. Do you know the most urban, sophisticated playback singing voice in the history of Hindi cinema has largely sung for Mithun Chakravarti, Vijay Benedict. Vijay
mm.
Benedict's enunciation is the best when it comes to certain English words. He's a guy who will say love. He's not going to say love. So somewhere it's a great match of strange stars aligning if you think about Mithun Chakravarti and what he has achieved.
Yeah. And
True. There is.
Koral made the point about music. So music, of course, it starts with disco dancer and a lot of, but one has one's favorites. I, for example, had a blast watching that film in which the song was Julie Julie Jani Ka Dil Tuj Pe Aaya Julie. Like
जीते हैं
it
शान से.
was.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jeete Hain Shaan Se, like, and C.T. Mar, I actually watched a lot of his films. I actually watched a lot of his films in the late night 9 o'clock show at Paras Cinema in Nehru Place, where people used to actually, at that show, a lot of the audience were, people who worked in the nearby construction thing, what they're construction laborers or workers, and you actually saw the kind of, uh, passion that he created when he sang Julie Julie Jani Ka Dil Jis Pe Aaya Julie and that kind of thing, so that's where, and of course, at the other extreme you had that song in I think Prem Pratigya. It was Kishore Kumar's song. Kaun sa tha, Gautam? Sheeshe ki umr pyale se.
हाँ.
Mm,
Kishore Kumar had a great song, and then even Happy had a great song, Pyar Kabhi
हाँ,
Kam Na Hai. And even,
हाँ,
I mean, if you want to look at the high point of music, some of that's great songs are Mithun Chakravarti songs. I mean, Sitara, and it's
Sitara, yeah.
amazing that the range that guy would have, or a film like Mujrim, just
Mm,
got really campy songs, but
mm,
great fun. And Aa Gaya Halwa Wala Aa Gaya. I mean, imagine somebody
हाँ.
worth their money singing that song today. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine somebody doing that today with so much of finesse.
Very true that. Thank you so much, Gautam, Dev, and Shantanu for joining us this evening. And I hope that we get one opportunity sometime in the near future when all of us, four of us, sit together and watch one of the Mitunda flicks together and laugh our heart out, or probably do some of his stunts and surprise each other. So we hope that is waiting for us in the near future when we can do that. Thank you so much for joining. It was a
Thank you.
superb session, and I thoroughly enjoyed talking
Thanks.
to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Koral. Thank you, Dev. Thank you, Shantanu. The pleasure was entirely mine. Thank you.